In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to explain the theoretical crux of this chapter, What is a Camp, by Giorgio Agamben, which is included in the book Means Without End. So the theoretical crux of this particular chapter is important because it informs one of the important juridical political after effects of 9/11. So Agamben over here describes the historical development of camp as a physical structure, but then where his real contribution lies in is his theorization of camp as a concept. And that's exactly what we are interested in. So when you watch the films related to 9/11, you would recall many of the concepts from this chapter to analyze those films and many of the situations in those films. So the central question over here for Agamben and for us is, what is a camp? What is its political juridical structure? And how could such events have taken place there? Of course, he is referring to all those dehumanized incidents of rights, violation of rights, and destruction of human dignity in the camps, referring to various camp-like structures which emerged in Europe. I think one prime example is the concentration camps in Germany. So keeping that question in mind, that is, what is a camp, we move on to the theoretical explanation of this concept. So as we scroll down here and read this highlighted part, one cannot overestimate the importance of this constitutive nexus between state of exception and concentration camp for a correct understanding of the nature of the camp. Now, the phrase that stands out over here is state of exception. And the idea is that there is a nexus between state of exception and concentration camp. And it is that nexus which makes a camp possible. The question is, what is state of exception? So Agamben has another book with the same title, State of Exception, written in 2005, where he elaborates these concepts in more detail. But over here, for the purpose of this particular article, we are focusing on the concept of state of exception only to the extent as we needed to understand the concept of camp. So state of exception is, as the phrase implies, an exceptional functionality of any modern state. So the exceptional functionality of the modern state can be characterized in various ways, but one of the prevalent ways is to make a state function or make some of the functions to operate in a state through presidential executive orders. So the presidential executive orders override the congressional approval. Often they override even the right of the Congress to know the nature, the importance, and the specificities of the executive orders which have been issued by the president. Of course, all that happens in the interest of the state. So, state functions in exception at the moment when one certain state action is empowered by or is authorized by the president of the state without seeking approval from the Congress. Now, that is moment of exception in a particular state. Now, if that moment of exception becomes a norm and appears too frequently, then a state which is allowing those kinds of exceptions to happen would be characterized as an exception state, right? So the word state over here is a kind of double-edged. It means both the form, right? So state, a form of something, right? State of something, form of something, but it also is the nation state. So we can look at this word both ways. So state of exception would be a nation state which exists for the time being through the exceptional executive orders being issued by the head of the state. But then state of exception is also the situation which emerges out of such executive orders. Now, Agamben's point of view is that once exceptional becomes norm because of its persistent repetition, that results into a permanent state of exception. He also calls it a permanent state of emergency. Now, his viewpoint is that camp or concentration camp as a juridical political structure is a place where state of exception becomes a rule or state of exception becomes a norm. In other words, a camp embodies state of exception. We will go in further elaboration. As we scroll down here and read this highlighted part, the camp is the space that opens up when the state of exception starts to become the rule, right? So it is pretty much the same thing I already stated. So in it, I continue to read, the state of exception, which was essentially a temporal suspension of the state of law, acquires a permanent spatial arrangement that as such remains constantly outside the normal state of law, right? So I think it is self-explanatory. So state of exception, which was supposed to be a temporal suspension, a suspension within the bounds of time, it just becomes a permanent spatial arrangement. So there could be various configurations of a statewide functionality of state of exception, right? There are other places where we can discuss that, but for the time being and for the purpose of this particular chapter, we just stick to this concept that if this kind of suspension of state of law takes place within a fixed bounds of a detention center, so to say, then detention center turns into a camp, right? So beginning of the normalization of state of exception is the beginning of the beginning of the space of camp. So allow me to scroll down over here. Now this part is, further theoretical elaboration of what we just discussed. So one ought to reflect on, I'm reading the highlighted part again. So one ought to reflect on the paradoxical status of the camp as space of exception. The camp is a piece of territory, right? It has territorial existence. The camp is a piece of territory that is placed outside the normal juridical order. For all that, however, it is not simply an external space. According to the etymological meaning of the term, exception, escapere, what is being excluded in the camp is captured outside. That is, it is included by virtue of its very exclusion. Thus, what is being captured under the rule of law is first of all the very state of exception. In other words, if sovereign power is founded on the ability to decide on the state of exception, the camp is structure in which the state of exception is permanently realized. Now, over here, Agamben is pointing at the paradoxical structure of, let me rephrase myself, paradoxical theoretical structure of a camp. So, camp is by design created outside the normal juridical order of any state. What does that mean? That means that while the institution of police, for example, in any given state has certain laws and sub-laws and rules and regulations to follow in order to exercise power on the citizens. Even if the intensity of and the extraordinary nature of power that the police enjoy, even if it is unusual power that the police seem to have, there is always that parameter within which they have to function. And that parameter is the normal juridical order. So the degree of power that police could exercise has a limit to it within the state of law. The camp is not within the state of law. The camp is outside the state of law. Once it is outside the state of law, that means any treatment could be meted out to the inhabitants of a camp. So the sergeant or the officers appointed in a camp, they have limitless freedom to inflict any kind of pain, torture, on the inhabitants. There is no check on that. But this freedom, the extraordinary freedom, the exceptional freedom that the police or the officer, not the police, but the officer has in a camp, that freedom is provided through the executive order. And the executive order itself is rooted in the law of the state. Now, that is the paradox. So we can phrase that paradox in these words, that it is the law itself which creates lawlessness. So the camp is outside the normal juridical order in the sense that camp is by design created in order to enable the limitless powers which officers could exercise on the inhabitants. But that limitlessness, so to say, of the powers that they enjoy is authorized through something that is limited, which is the state of law itself. So state of law enables state of lawlessness, right? So that is the paradoxical structure, and that is what we mean by being excluded. So the camp is excluded from the normal state of law, right? And that exclusion, now this is a little complex, but you know, we can always make sense of that. So that very exclusion of the camp from the mainstream juridical order, that very exclusion works through through the inclusion of what? The inclusion of the inhabitant, of the detainee in the camp, right? So exclusion and inclusion, they work simultaneously, right? So the camp is imagined as an excluded juridical structure, which is at the same time included, right? Its exclusion is thought in terms of an exclusion, but that exclusion is not it is not a cutoff point. It does not separate the camp from the normal juridical order, right? So the very exclusion includes it in the overall state of law. But camp can exist only as an exclusion in order to enable any kind of treatment with the inhabitants. Okay, so let me continue to read from here. So Hannah Arendt observed once that what comes to light in the camps is the principle that supports totalitarian domination, and that common sense stubbornly refuses to admit to, namely the principle according to which anything is possible. Anything is possible, right? So totalitarian domination, I think this is a very useful characterization of the kind of control that officers enjoy in a detention center, right? So they can exercise what we call totalitarian domination. It is only because I'm continuing to read again. It is only because the camps constitute a space of exception, a space in which the law is completely suspended, that everything is truly possible in them. If one does not understand this particular political juridical structure of the camps, whose vocation is precisely to realize permanently the exception, the incredible events that took place in them remain entirely unintelligible, right? But they become intelligible to us. They become intelligible to us precisely that we now know that the camps exist through the suspension of law. So the people who entered the camp moved about in a zone of indistinction between the outside and the inside, the exception and the rule, the licit and the illicit, in which every juridical protection had disappeared. However, if they were Jews, so reference to concentration camps, they had already been deprived of citizenship rights by Nuremberg laws and were later completely denationalized at the moment of the final solution. In as much as, so this italicized part is very important, in as much as its inhabitants, that is inhabitants of a camp, have been stripped of every political status and reduced completely to naked life, the camp is also the most absolute biopolitical space that has ever been realized. A space in which power confronts nothing other than pure biological life without any mediation, right? So the inhabitant is treated as a life, right? As a biological life, right? And this is a very provocative way to put to us the nature of life that inhabitants experience in a camp, right? So reduction of a human to their biological self would mean the stripping of human of all the rights which are given to them for being human, right? So this is dehumanization, right? It is reduction of human life to biological life, right? And that is enabled in a camp, right? So there is one more thing that I would like to point out, and then it will be the end of it. So this part, if this is the case, if the essence of the camp consists in the materialization of the state of exception and in the consequent creation of a space for naked life as such, right? So naked life, I hope you get it, is the biological life, right? We will then have to admit to be facing a camp virtually every time that such a structure is created, regardless of the nature of the crimes committed in it, and regardless of the denomination and specific topography it might have, right? So what does it mean? It means the concept of camp is mobile, right? It can move from places to places, right? So it's not that a state declares a camp to be a camp, and only then we identify that to be a camp, right? Rather, we can work, bottom top. We can look at the conditions which are being created in a given space, right? Where naked life comes in connection with limitless power, right? So that is the creation of a camp, and it can have various forms, various structures, various topographies, and various geographies as well, right? So this is what Agamben means by a camp. So just to sum up, Agamben responds to this question, what is a camp, by saying that camp is a space where state of exception is made permanent, and also where human life is reduced to biological life, and also that is a space which is paradoxical in the sense that it is excluded from the mainstream juridical political order, and through exclusion it is included as well at the same time. And the life which moves in these camps that life is at the point of indistinction. That is, it moves between law and lawlessness. Now that is very, very important, It is in the state of lawlessness because the officer appointed over there could do anything with that life, right? But again, that lawlessness is being informed by a certain law at the same time, right? So this paradoxical structure is it seems to be purposeful because it it refuses to um, it refuses to uh, take one side. It refuses to assign clarity to the life of the detainees. It refuses to say that, look, these lives are being subjected to total lawlessness, right? So this state of exception purposefully confuses the legal structure of the lives of these inhabitants. So these inhabitants are simultaneously within the frame of law and without the frame of law. They are simultaneously in a civilized world and in an uncivilized world. In other words, they are in a void. And that void is what Agamben calls state of indistinction. So no distinction can be assigned to these lives, right? And that indistinction, in fact, fails the discourse of human rights to get activated. So human rights discourse does not really come to rescue the lives which are experiencing the status of being naked lives in a camp. So thank you for listening. Let me know if you have any questions.